All right, so continuing on with Dewey's logic. Just before this, Dewey had been talking about a couple of things, well, several things, but two that are important to keep in mind. So proximate versus ultimate subject matter of logic, proximate subject matter being those specific relations, if then, and so on. And ultimate subject matter being more the meta questions of where do these logical forms come from. We were also introduced to Dewey's basic hypothesis about logic, about this ultimate subject matter of logic. These ultimate questions are meta questions. In Dewey's view, the logical forms, or the forms of logic, I should say, come out of the operations of inquiry. So when we're inquiring in a process of inquiry, that's where these uh, logical forms ultimately come from, as well as, of course, through reflection on inquiry. Anyway, going on with this next paragraph, it is not the task of this chapter to try to justify this hypothesis. So the hypothesis I just mentioned, Dewey's hypothesis about the nature of logic, where logical forms come from. So it's not the nature to try to justify this hypothesis, not the task of this chapter, sorry, to try to justify this hypothesis or to show that it satisfies the three conditions laid down. And on the previous page, Dewey had mentioned three conditions for that a hypothesis about logic must satisfy. Just to quickly remind you of those. So the hypothesis must be of the nature of a vera causa, so something that can be empirically verified. The second condition is that it must be able to order and account for the proximate subject matter of logic. So it must be able to account for all those different logical forms, if, then, some, all, things like that. Then um, the third condition is that it needed to be able to account for the alternative hypotheses. All right, so that is the business of the work as a whole. So he's not going to try to accomplish all of that in this chapter, but this is what the book is about. So continuing. But I wish to emphasize 2 points preparatory to expounding the meaning, not the justification, of the conception, an exposition that is the main task of the present chapter. So he's going to make 2 points, basically, about the meaning of his conception of logic. So one of them is that any revulsion against the position just indicated, against Dewey's position, should be tempered by appreciation of the fact that all other conceptions of logical subject matter that are now entertained are equally hypothetical. So, right, if you may find Dewey's hypothesis about logic repulsive. You may dislike it, but recognize that all conceptions of logical subject matter are equally hypothetical, at least at the time that Dewey was writing. If they do not seem to be so, if they do not seem to be hypothetical, it's just because of their familiarity, because we're familiar with them, he writes. If sheer dogmatism is to be avoided, any hypothesis, no matter how unfamiliar, should have a fair chance to be judged by its results. Right? So the results are really what count. Figure out what the results of different hypotheses are, and then make a judgment about what you think is the best one. So he goes on. The other point is that inquiries, numerous in variety and comprehensive in scope, do exist and are open to public examination. Inquiry is the lifeblood of every science and is constantly employed in every art, craft, and profession. In short, the hypothesis represents a vera causa, no matter what doubt may attend its applicability in the field of logic. So his hypothesis about inquiry, about the nature of inquiry and the relation of inquiry to logic, is not just applicable to logic, but you see this in other things. And I'll mention some of these other fields, right? Art, craft, other professions So inquiry occurs everywhere, right? In all manner of domains of human life. And so we can verify Dewey's ideas by looking at other fields, not just at logic itself, but looking farther afield. The next paragraph, he writes, further elucidation of the meaning of the position taken will proceed largely in terms of objections that are most likely to arise. The most basic of these objections is that the field indicated, that of inquiries, is already preempted. There is, it will be said, a recognized subject which deals with it. That subject is methodology, and there is a well-recognized distinction between methodology and logic, the former being an application of the latter. So Dewey's going to talk about various objections that might arise toward his view. One of them is that what he's actually talking about is methodology. So when he's talking about inquiry, you could make the objection that, well, this is just the field of methodology rather than logic. And methodology is applied logic. So he's really mixing up what he's talking about. That could be one objection. But it certainly cannot be shown, short of the total development of the position taken, that this objection is not just. But it may be noted that assertion in advance of a fixed difference between logic and the methodology of scientific and practical inquiry begs the fundamental question at issue. So you're making an assumption here. If you make this objection, you're kind of not getting at the actual fundamental issue. The fact that most of the extant treatises upon methodology have been written upon the assumption of a fixed difference between the two does not prove that the difference exists. So in the literature, there exists this distinction between methodology and logic, but that does not itself prove that there is an actual useful distinction to be made between methodology and logic. Moreover, he writes, the relative failure of works on logic that have identified logic and methodology, I may cite the logic of Mill as an example, does not prove that the identification is doomed to failure. So some works have identified methodology and logic, as in Mill, and maybe these have not been very successful, but that doesn't necessarily mean that an identification between methodology and logic is, as he says, doomed to failure. For the failure may not be inherent. In any case, a priori assumption of dualism between logic and methodology can only be prejudicial to unbiased examination, both of methods of inquiry and logical subject matter. So I think that's fairly clear. So don't just assume a dualism between logic and methodology. Let's figure out whether we actually need this distinction or whether it's doing more harm than good in our critical thinking. But going on to the next paragraph, he writes, the plausibility of the view that sets up a dualism between logic and methodology of inquiry, between logic and scientific method, is due to a fact that is not denied. So there is some good reason for making this distinction between logic and inquiry. Between logic and methodology of inquiry. So inquiry, in order to reach valid conclusions, must itself satisfy logical requirements. It is an easy inference from this fact to the idea that the logical requirements are imposed upon methods of inquiry from without. So the fact that inquiry must satisfy logic gives rise to the idea that logic is something you impose on inquiry, sort of from the outside. So going on to the next sentence here, since inquiries and methods are better and worse, logic involves a standard for criticizing and evaluating them, right? Logic gives us tools for evaluating some inquiries, whether some inquiries and methods are better than others. How, it will be asked, can inquiry which has to be evaluated by reference to a standard be itself the source of a standard, right? If, as Dewey says, the logical forms come out of the process of inquiry, how can it be used to evaluate that inquiry? How can inquiry, he writes, how can inquiry originate logical forms, as it has been stated that it does, and yet be subject to the requirements of these forms? The question is one that must be met. It can be adequately answered only in the course of the entire discussion that follows. You got to read the whole thing to to learn why that can happen, why that makes sense. But the meaning of the position taken may be clarified by indicating the direction in which the answer will be sought. All right, so let's find out what direction the answer to this question will be sought. So he writes, the development reduced to its lowest terms is whether inquiry can develop in its own ongoing course the logical standards and forms to which further inquiry shall submit. So further inquiry in the future. So can inquiry in the present help the development of logical standards by which future inquiry can be controlled? He writes, one might reply by saying that it can because it has, right? This is a historical argument. You can look at the history and see how past inquiry has influenced or improved future inquiry, or the inquiry that came next. One might even challenge the objector to produce a single instance of improvement in scientific methods not produced in and by the self-corrective process of inquiry. A single instance that is due to application of standards ab extra. So the application of standards from without, from outside of inquiry. So can you actually produce an example of this? But such a retort needs to be justified. Some kind of inquiry began presumably as soon as man appeared on Earth. Of prehistoric methods of inquiry, our knowledge is vague and speculative. But we know a good deal about different methods that have been used in historic times. We know that the methods which now control science are of comparatively recent origin in both physical and mathematical science. So Dewey will often give historical examples, look at different ideas about how science should be done from different periods of time. And he does this in all his philosophy. He gives kind of historically grounded arguments for his views. So next paragraph, end of page 13. Moreover, different methods have not different methods have been not only tried, but they have been tried out, that is, tested. So we test them, see which ones work better than others. The developing course of science thus presents us with an imminent criticism of methods previously tried. Right? So again, history, developing course of science. You can look back at the history of science, and it's a kind of like an imminent criticism, a criticism of itself, of its own methods, because methods change. We figure out what works, what doesn't work, we change. Earlier methods, let's see, yeah, very bottom of page 13. Earlier methods failed in some important respect. In consequence of this failure, they were modified so that more dependable results were secured. Earlier methods yielded conclusions that could not stand the strain put upon them by further investigation. It is not merely that conclusions were found to be inadequate or false, but that they were found to be so because of methods employed. So one important aspect of science is not just that we learn that this or that conclusion was wrong, but that the way of getting to that conclusion was wrong or not as effective as we might want. Other methods of inquiry were found to be such that persistence in them not only produced conclusions that stood the strain of further inquiry, but that tended to be self-rectifying. They were methods that improved with and by use. Right, so that's part of his argument for why logic comes out of inquiry, out of the process of inquiry, is because we can see that methods of inquiry have improved over time and improved by how they were used, right? developing methods of inquiry that are more self-rectifying than others or self-corrective. All right, I'm going to read this, go through this one more paragraph. So Dewey writes, it may be instructive to compare the improvement of scientific methods within inquiry with the improvement that has taken place in the progress of the arts. So making a comparison here between science and what has happened in the arts. He writes, is there any reason to suppose that the advance in the art of metallurgy has been due to application of an external standard? The norms used at present have developed out of the process by which metallic ores were formerly treated. There were needs to be satisfied, consequences to be reached. As they were reached, new needs and new possibilities opened to view, and old processes were remade to satisfy them. In short, some procedures worked, some succeeded in reaching the end intended, others failed. The latter were dropped, the former were retained and extended. So if you look at something like metallurgy, and you can look at any other kind of field probably, and you can look at how people have tried to reach their goals in that medium, in that field, in that domain of life. And you see that some procedures work, some don't, and we tend to keep around ones that seem to work better than others. Continuing on around here. So it is true, quite true. It is quite true that modern improvements in technologies have been determined by advance in mathematics and physical science. But these advances in scientific knowledge are not external canons to which the arts have had automatically to submit themselves. They provided new instrumentalities, right? New tools, new ways of doing things. But the instrumentalities were not self-applying. They were used. And it was the result of their use, their failure and success in accomplishing ends and effecting consequences that provided the final criterion of the value of scientific principles for carrying on determinate technological operations. Right. So advances in various fields have been influenced, for example, by advances in mathematics, but these aren't just, these advances in mathematics, just to take that example, are not just external standards, right? They can't just be used as external standards. You actually have to apply them and see if they work, see if they use and that are see if they're useful, if they are effective in that particular endeavor that you have. Yeah, so I think last couple of sentences here. So what is said is not intended as proof that the logical principles involved in scientific method have themselves arisen in the progressive course of inquiry, but it is meant to show that the hypothesis that they have so arisen has a prima facie claim to be entertained, final decision being reserved. So it's at least, conceivable, Dewey is saying. It's not, he hasn't proved his point yet, but he wants to say that it's at least conceivable that logical standards arise through the process of inquiry, through the progressive course of inquiry. All right, and I will stop here and continue on in the next video. Thanks for listening.